Okay, good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the Center for Chinese Studies, I welcome you all to this special session. My name is Mingbao Yu. I'm the director of the Center for Chinese Studies, and we are delighted and honored to co-sponsor today's session in collaboration with the Center for Southeast Asian Studies on the topic, the impact of China's Belt Road Initiative on Southeast Asia. The moderator, and this is a hybrid session, right? So please pay attention to that. And during the Q&A, there might be people who want to ask and raise their hands that we have to pay attention to. Okay, so the moderator for today's session is Professor Miriam Stark. She's the director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and she will introduce our distinguished panel of speakers, two of which are here in person and one who is online. Okay, so without further ado, Professor Miriam Stark.
Thank you, Dr. Yu, and thank you everyone for coming in person and I see online. It's my great pleasure today to moderate this session. We have four stellar colleagues and we cajoled all of them into working with us on this session. I know them from different spheres of my life, and I will say that they are all largely social scientists, and they have all agreed to talk with us about impacts of the Belt and Road Initiative in Southeast Asia from different perspectives. I did want to point out each of them has a different relationship with our Centers for Chinese Studies and Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I guess I should start with a faculty member. Our newest faculty member in the Asian Studies program is Dr. Shuxian, and we'd like to welcome her. Her background's in international relations, and she brings great intellectual muscle to our work, both in Masters in Asian International Affairs and generally to the UH system, just working from closest to UH and moving out. And then I want to introduce Dr. Jefferson Fox, who is at the East-West Center still part-time, but he's been an affiliate graduate faculty for both anthropology and geography since time immemorial. And his work has focused on land cover and land use changes across much of Southeast Asia and Southeast Asia for the last 40 years. So he brings, with a really strong research program, of a multi-decade research program, he brings a lot of experience generally. He's warned me he's mostly going to talk about Cambodia. But he's also done extensive work in Vietnam and in Indonesia, and also he works with colleagues in Thailand. Then I wanted to introduce Dr. Kevin Woods here, who is a great, rather more recent addition both to East-West Center as a researcher in the research division, and also he's a graduate affiliate with geography, has been for several years. And Kevin is, I'm not sure if he calls himself a geographer. It's okay.
Among several things.
And Kevin has a very deep track record, among other things, in working in Myanmar, particularly in some of the areas of Myanmar that are contested and are, in fact, very hot now. But also those areas along the borders or fringes are areas where we see a very deep intervention by Chinese investments. So we couldn't resist inviting Kevin. And I have to invite Dr. Im Sok Samphoas, who I believe is going to be zooming in from Ann Arbor, right, Samphoas?
Actually, I'm zooming in from Palo Alto.
Oh, because she's currently a postdoc with Stanford, although she also has an affiliation at the University of Michigan. She's a political science PhD. She did get her degree from University of Hawaii at Manoa, and she's distinguished herself with a variety of academic positions since then. So I'm going to first ask each of them to, and I guess I will pick on people, to give just a couple of minutes of their background with respect to this topic. And then after that, we have a series of questions, which I'll ask. So now I'm going to go in reverse order. I'm going to start with Samphoas. Could you give us just a few minutes of your background with respect to this topic? Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, everyone who joining our roundtable today in person and online. And also thank you to Professor Miriam Stark for extending the invitation for me to join the roundtable today. My name is Samphoas, and as Professor Stark mentioned earlier, I graduated from UH Manoa with a PhD in political science 2 years ago. And my field of specialization is actually comparative politics, social policy, and Southeast Asian studies. I tend to describe myself as an interdisciplinary social scientist because I engage with many different topic of research. But I also want to note that the BRI is not really my primary topic, but I have keeping a close observation on its impact because it has many implications on other socioeconomic issues in Cambodia. And yeah, that's about it, about my research background and where I came from. And I'm glad to be here today with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Samphoas. And Kevin, would you give a little intro next, please?
Sure. Thanks, Miriam. So I label myself as a human geographer and political ecologist. For 2 decades, I have been working continuously on the China-Myanmar border, mostly from the Myanmar side, although also to some extent from the China side that ended about 5 or 6 years ago, looking at a different type of Chinese investment, which was a purposeful strategy because of a lot of the focus on large-scale infrastructure. I looked instead at resource extraction, particularly timber, and then agribusiness. So this was definitely smaller scale. These were not being conducted by SOEs, right? It was a little bit of the inverse of BRIs.
Mm-hmm.
So my interest in BRI is actually as a comparative to that, like what sort of similarities or differences do we see in terms of how it kind of meshes in with the political context within which these projects are taking place, which are, at least in this borderland area, armed conflict territories contested by paramilitaries and ethnic political armed organizations resisting the military. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. How about Jeff next?
Well, as you said, Miriam, I'm the old man here. I've worked across the region, including Nepal as well, but I spent, when I speak Bahasa Indonesia and Nepali, the Bahasa is not very good anymore. I've done a lot of work in mainland Southeast Asia, and I've done, well, Laos and Cambodia, I've considered talking about. Vietnam, I think, is a whole different story. But I am sort of zeroed in on Cambodia because I know it a little better. Samphoas, we're going to bring totally different takes on this because I do the natural resource management and you've got the political science. And correct me when I've got my argument wrong, please.
Thank you. We will definitely complement each other.
So thank you. And Shuxian, I know we just asked you to come in as a new faculty member, but I'm sure that with your broad knowledge, you could speak to this. So maybe you could give us a little bit of information on your background.
Sure. Thank you for having me. So my primary focus is on China's maritime territorial and boundary disputes, and I focus on China's crisis behavior, how to negotiate, how to bargain, with other countries involved in the South China Sea disputes. So I won't claim that BRI is my primary area of expertise, but my work kind of touches on how BRI, whether and to what extent BRI translate into some bargaining power on the Southeast Asian countries' part when they deal with China in their maritime disputes.
Thank you very much. And I should say that we're including people here who've had a variety of very prestigious postdocs and positions in this area. So even if they don't feel like they're BRI specialists, they certainly can speak to the topic. I'd like to throw a question out. We have a series of questions we agreed on, and then I'll just let you decide who wants to speak first. So our first question is, what are some of the most productive impacts of China's BRI in the country you study? So let's start with the clear evidence that China's been able to jumpstart a lot of development in Southeast Asia. And maybe you could just give some examples you're familiar with. Anyone want to start? Samphoas. Oh, she's muted. Can you unmute, please?
Okay, yeah. I guess, I can just point out a few things that I know about the productive impact of China with my observation over the years. So with regard to the BRI project development in Cambodia, and since its launch 10 years ago, the projects that have been the signature one have been mainly the infrastructure development and the industrial development with regard to the special economic zone. And these two major developments have facilitated economic growth in Cambodia over the last decades, and through manufacturing and exporting of garment and textile goods to the EU and US markets. And in industrial development linked to this BRI project, especially with the special economic zone and the establishment of the factories and in Cambodia, have created tens of thousands of jobs for ordinary Cambodians in manufacturing and also other low added value industries such as garment and travel goods. But and then another one that have recently inaugurated actually is during COVID-19 was the express freeway that connected Cambodia's capital to the Sihanouk Ville, the Cambodia's only deep water seaport, and that has been another major one because Cambodia have never had any express freeway before this this road were built. And so the government really took a lot of pride on this development. And also I should mention that the new airports that they just inaugurated 2 months ago in Siem Reap. So those are the major infrastructure that really made it very visible in Cambodia, and also allowing the government to also claim their performance legitimacy too, as being that BRI has drive Cambodia forward for development. And it has the projects that I mentioned have actually enjoyed a very high level of support from both the Phnom Penh and Beijing governments, and even touted as the model or a successful project that actually fed into Cambodian government ideology on and legitimacy narratives that depend on continual economic growth. So these are just some of the things that I think that really made a huge impact with regard to BRI projects in Cambodia.
Thanks. Jeff, did you want to follow up with anything?
Yeah, because it stays on Cambodia. I first flew into Phnom Penh in December 1990. So yeah, I'd like to look at a little longer history, because the country at that time, this is a year after the Vietnamese left, was in total destruction. All the infrastructure had to be rebuilt. And many countries stepped in to help. ADB was at the front line, but the World Bank, Australia, UK, US, France, Thailand, Korea, and China, they were all there. And I think it's important to put infrastructure in Cambodia, particularly the roads, in that broader context. Then in terms of the BRI initiatives, and I may be off here, Samphoas, but the Sihanouk Ville Road, there were two. There's an older one, which the Chinese built, and then the new one, which just completed again. This time that they built that first road with their investment, the Japanese built the road from Phnom Penh to the Cambodian border that leads directly to Ho Chi Minh City. Similarly with Sihanouk Ville, the special economic zone, that was built with Chinese money. Yes, but it doesn't do any good without the port. This is your only ocean port, and that was built with Japanese money. So I think an argument can be made that the Cambodian government, the Hun Sen government, has actually tried to balance, at least until very recently, different donors. They didn't want to be in anyone's basket. Now, since the whole China-US relationship, it does seem to be going more and more China-related.
Kevin, did you want to comment at all about Myanmar?
Of all questions that I'm not overly excited to answer, this would be one of them. Other than to say, depends how, productive for whom. So it's been productive for military elites and ethnic Chinese elites to capture resource rent-seeking opportunities from these projects, which, if anyone knows Myanmar, is how big business operates in that country. So that's how it's productive from that perspective.
Did China also invest BRI funds in the infrastructure the way it sunk it into Cambodia?
Yes, but I think those are better attuned to other questions during our discussion.
Shuxian, did you have anything you wanted to add?
As on the part of China, I think I can bring up a couple of points. One is now BRI stands at its 10th anniversary, and Xi Jinping, during his speech at the BRI forum just a few weeks ago, talk about the plan going forward for BRI to focus more on small but beautiful projects, alongside those large scale projects. I think if a positive thing observed here is the Chinese are learning. There's a learning curve there. And if we look at, since Japan was also added in this conversation, I think there's some kind of parallel that could be drawn between Japan's ODA in Southeast Asia versus where China now stands at with respect to BRI in Southeast Asia, because we observed in the early stage of Japanese ODA in 1950s, 1960s, until mid-1970s, the Japanese ODA in Southeast Asia also encountered a lot of backlash in the way how they ran. That prompted Japan to rethink about its relation, especially its development policy towards Southeast Asia, and prompted the Prime Minister Sukuda Takeo at that time to call for a heart-to-heart relationship and rethinking about how Japan runs its ODA in Southeast Asia. I think there might be some parallel, rethinking and rebranding and reframing of how China wants to run its BRI as well going forward. So that might be hopefully a positive change that can be observed on the Chinese side. And also, I think conceptually, there need to be a quick clarification as to, because when we talk about BRI projects, what projects we're actually talking about, because many of the projects that currently put on the BRI banner actually predate the BRI, which was only proposed by China only 10 years ago. And even the Chinese government itself cannot identify which projects are considered BRI and which ones are not, for example, in Malaysia, right? So it was kind of, reflecting the poorly coordinated nature of BRI. And, as many scholars have observed, BRI is more likely a casual branding or rebranding of many probably unrelated projects by optimistic actors, not only at the national level, right, but also at subnational level, non-state actors as well, private actors, seeking political or financial advantages rather than a well-coordinated geopolitical or development strategy. I think I'll stop there.
No, that's very helpful. It kind of leads into the next question, which is to what extent these kinds of impacts, branded as BRI or not, I suppose, have contributed both to economic development and to political stability in your country of research, or whether you view some of it as economic maldevelopment or political instability.
I don't know. Should I let Jeff start first, since I started the last question?
I'll take my shot. You correct it, because it's your country. But I would start with the Cambodian government, the CPP government, Hun Sen's government. I mean, Kevin was talking about cronyism and corrupt governments. I mean, it starts there. It's not China. I think the Hun Sen government is playing this out the way they wanted it, to their own advantage. Yeah. They are letting people, there's a couple good examples. The Lower Sesan River, Lower Sesan 2 Dam. that was started by the Vietnamese. They were going to build the dam for electric to be exported to Vietnam. They kind of backed out. The Chinese were going to develop the whole thing under this. It wasn't BRI per se, but it was overseas capital. And then the Hun Sen said, I don't want that. And he got one of his rich cronies to pony up 49% of the capital. So they'll benefit, and they're keeping it balanced. I really think that in terms of political power and economic power, yes, China's there, but I see it the main actor is the Cambodian government.
I completely agree with Jeff on this, and also thanks Shuxian for leading the ways on this too, that the BRI project, as many scholars have put it, like Neil Laughlin, for example, or Hillman, talking about how the initiative of the BRI initiative is not, it's not complete to think of it as like it's a China-led project. It's always the recipient countries, well, not always, at least in the case of Cambodia, it's a recipient-led initiative, because like in the case of Cambodia, the launch of the BRI in 2013 actually coincide very well with the troubled domestic politics in Cambodia, when the CPP, long-ruling CPP government was challenged by the oppositions. And so the launch of the BRI and the projects in Cambodia actually have the Cambodian government to promote their legitimacy, and by bringing in new development into the country and bring jobs to the people. And all of this development also supported by the BRI have also enabled the Cambodian government to also toll for its performance legitimacy, which I mentioned earlier, that that it also even came up with a slogan that's saying no peace, no development. So in the last decades after the CPP, Cambodian People's Government dismantled the opposition. And so with the slogan saying no peace, no development, it's, if you go to Cambodia, you'll see the slogans hang everywhere on the streets. And so with that slogan, they leverage it to say that the Cambodian government saying, so Cambodia can only achieve this development with the peace, but the Cambodian people should remember that who brought and maintained peace in Cambodia, of course, seeking to claim credit for the CPP government for driving success and stability into the country. So I guess I'll stop here, but this is the things that have allowed the CPP government to kind of co-opt their coercive strategy with these development projects to bring stability and peace in Cambodia in recent years.
So I know, Kevin, you wouldn't call yourself a political scientist, but might you on this on Myanmar?
Yeah, definitely not a political scientist. But what I am interested, which this is like the main question of the panel that I'm interested in speaking to, is how BRI projects are shaped by the political context within their operating, as well as the national context of the recipient country. And this, Myanmar is a really fascinating case study for that, because of everything going on in Myanmar and where these projects are located on the, or at least entering in Myanmar on the Yunnan border with Kachin State and Shan State, for those of you who are familiar with the geography of northern Myanmar. So just quickly, there has been a trajectory over the past 10 or 12 years of how BRI has been unfolding in Myanmar as the country's politics has gone like this. So when Thein Sein's government took power in 2011 during starting the reform period, that was actually when major Chinese invested projects started to get canceled, especially the Myitsone Dam, which, if any of you last month were at the film, that dam that film was about got shelved in 2011. Chinese were pissed. This was a multi-billion-dollar project. And that is how that administration started their relationship with Chinese investment. And that kind of and then more projects that were major keystone projects of the Chinese were getting canceled, and other ones that the government were continuing to back. Civil society said basically, hell no, this is not happening. The Letpadong copper mine, for those of you familiar, that was a major project that civil society was resisting and continues to resist to this day. Then there was something called the Rohingya crisis that happened in 2017. Western governments were like, oh, we are now done supporting this regime. We cannot support Myanmar at this time because of genocide, or however you want to label that atrocity. And so Western donors and governments way backed off. Suddenly we have a major geopolitical shift during that time, and China quite brilliantly stepped in and said, no worries, we are still here. Mm-hmm. Suddenly BRI is rebranded. It is relabeled and reset, and then this is 2017, just a matter of several months after the Rohingya crisis and everything that unfolded from that. They launched what became called the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, or because Myanmar loves acronyms, CMEC. So now BRI is basically within Myanmar called CMEC, and specific Chinese projects fit under that framework. Okay, so then that was from 2017 until I skipped an important part of that. This is also when NLD was in power, starting in 2016. Okay, and they actually had a much more favorable relationship with the Chinese and BRI than the preceding regime that was military backed, which I think for some people who don't follow China-Myanmar relations find that surprising or counterintuitive. But NLD was pushing ahead with Chinese investments much more strongly and effectively than Thein Sein's administration. And then obviously, as I just mentioned, the Rohingya crisis kind of helped forge that investment alliance. Okay, so that was going, and then the coup in February of 2021, and basically that political crisis that is very much still unfolding has not been favorable, perhaps not surprisingly, to pushing ahead with these CMEC projects, mainly because of, one, the military is trying to just keep hold of power over the country, but also because ethnic political armed organizations are bombing, seriously, just like bombing these projects, which the Chinese are constantly trying to remind Min Aung Hlaing's military that they need to securitize these projects to keep them from being bombed and sabotaged. This welcome to Myanmar. Yeah. Civil society has always been opposed and continues, but because now we have kind of people's defense forces that are not the armed groups, but are kind of local militias fighting against the military in opposition to the coup, they are also now attacking these corridors. And so you just have multiple armed groups that are attacking these projects while the military is busy trying to hold power. There's so much more I can say in this, but I already felt like maybe I talked too much.
That's good. It's good. Shuxian, I wonder if it would be useful if we got a few more perspectives on these Southeast Asia specific questions, and then we open the lens, because you have a macro regional perspective that we might not be usually considering. Would that be okay with you if I asked a couple more questions of the regional specialists?
Sure, go ahead.
So thanks. Well, the next question was specifically about how Chinese involvement in your country, whether you call it BRI or not, is affecting national governance regarding natural resources. And I don't know whether you feel like you want to follow up at all on that, any of you.
Well, I think in Cambodia, take the Lower Sesan again, and this is what
Samphoas
was saying, I believe, but I'd like to hammer it in a little harder, and it very much echoes, I think, what Kevin was saying again, is that civil society groups and local people totally object to this. There are 5 or 6 different civil society groups working on fisheries and related issues around the Saison, and they're all totally objecting to it, but they won't say, don't build the dam, because they know they'll get put down by the government. So it's left to the individual people to do. And I don't know if it's changed since more recently, Samphoas, but I know that people are very opposed to these things. I know in the forestry field that there's been a couple foresters killed for protecting forest and by the military. So, yeah, again, I just keep on thinking and
Susha,
Yeah.
I think it's they've
It is
frozen.
connected.
Disconnected, yeah. I thought I'm my side.
No, I can see you still moving, so I guess it's not
Yeah,
my side.
okay. I saw you moving too. I was gonna message you.
I think
We can
they're
continue.
online.
Okay, because there's people here. Yeah, thanks. Sorry. So what we're going to do is we're going to continue because Samphoas here, Shuxian is here. We're all here. You just can't see them. The question is whether we can hear. Can you hear us? Yeah. You can hear us all right?
Yes.
Could one of you speak to see how loud we're
Yes.
doing?
Yes, I can hear you both. You all, yeah.
Can you get louder?
Yeah, I can hear you both.
I can hear you.
Keep
I can hear
talking for a
you.
minute. We're going to make it just as loud as we can, and then we'll try to reconnect to the bigger.
Okay.
Is that okay? All right. She did. Can you speak one more time?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. So should we turn it around? Okay. So let's just continue because we work in Southeast Asia. Like this is how we roll. So where we were leaving off. Oh, I think we're coming back in. Where we were. One minute. Now.
Yes.
Can we talk or should we wait?
Oh, you can.
Oh, we can talk. Right. So
Just you won't see them. That's all.
okay, but they can hear us and all the rest. All right, so let's get back to this. Right, so we were talking about how growing Chinese involvement affects national governance. And in the one case, I think what Samphoas and Jeff were talking about is how the Cambodian government has been able to effectively be agents in development and use this kind of investment now to link it with peace and the need for the need for peace. We'll just leave it at that. So in this case, they're linking economic development to stability. And then Shuxian had pointed out that this was what the Japanese had done in the 60s, 70s. I wanted to add that when I started working in Cambodia, which was right after Jeff, a few years later, the Japanese were pouring billions of dollars in as well. So it's a long-term process where the Cambodians have a role to play. And then Kevin was in some ways providing a contrast where there's political instability. Well, it's not an entire contrast, but the involvement is very closely related to the lack of to the need for stability, and where you don't have stability, you can't have as much involvement. What I was curious about is to the extent to which, since we're saying BRI is maybe a gloss, we know that there are companies that get involved. It's mostly not the Chinese government, but instead corporations. To what extent are migrants and refugees, diasporic Chinese communities in your country of research playing a role in these kinds of investments. And I don't know, Samphoas, if you're willing to talk about that first, and then probably Kevin next. But we're interested in how much it's really outsiders imposing on insiders, and how much it's insiders working with outsiders, and just different kinds of insiders.
To be honest, because Cambodia don't really have any refugees in Cambodia at the moment, so I guess.
She's misunderstanding.
But you have diasporic.
Oh,
So
sorry,
I
I think you were break up. I didn't hear the question again. Sorry, if you could repeat.
So there are diasporic Chinese communities across Southeast Asia. There are Sino-Khmers. And the story, I'll just say, I work in Cambodia, I'm an archaeologist, but the story from the inside is that there are all these Chinese who have come to Cambodia and they're doing it. Then alternately, there are people who are viewed as Sino-Khmer, right? And so our question is, to what extent do we actually see that it's outsiders coming in? To what extent are there people who are Sino-Khmers or Sino-Burmese who are also involved in this? What does the dynamic look like with these development projects? Is that sufficient?
Yeah. So I would point it out to with regard to the Sino-Khmer Chinese community, the diasporic community in Cambodia. Majority of them are a lot of them are entrepreneur elites, especially in the real estate development. And so they are actually the group that have benefited more from the BRI development project than the ordinary Khmer people, because, say, for example, one large real estate development in Cambodia, I wouldn't want to name it, but a majority of the tycoon, they are Sino-Khmer, and such as basically those that own all those large real estate companies have close connection with the government elites, and they have benefited a lot more from this development project, such as the one in that developed. Basically, it's like a conglomerate. They join with the Chinese investment company in Cambodia, and they're the one who facilitate all the technical process and like with regard to legal procedure and stuff like that in Cambodia. And I think these are the role that the Chinese community, at least from my perspective, that I see play in this process. I guess Jeff has more to say in this too.
Well, I just want to ask you about Sihanoukville. There are supposedly about 80,000 resident Chinese there now, and the total population of the Khmer was like maybe double that, maybe 140. And there's tons of Chinese tourists, at least up in, it's changed. I don't know what it's like since the pandemic, but and that was not Chinese state money at all. That was Chinese private money that built all gambling resorts and hotels, and that's a real myth. And
that's not BRI.
And that's not.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So that's another. That's a great point, Jeff. That's also that's the recent impact of the Chinese diaspora in Cambodia. That it's not the BRI money, but for some reason the development of the special economic zone in place like Sihanoukville has attracted a lot of these Chinese business people to come to Cambodia and establish a lot of casinos. Like, as you probably already know, that there's a huge booming casino and gambling industry in Cambodia that led to a lot of negative image and reaction also from the general publics. And even maybe if you've seen recently that just to rewind back a bit, the casino and the gambling industry that linked to the BRI development in Sihanoukville also caused a lot of like gang activity and crimes crimes and in Sihanoukville, and that even led to not only negative reactions from the Cambodian public, even in China itself, that recently they released a movie saying that Cambodia is not a safe place to travel to. That led to a decline of like the slow recovery of Chinese tourists to Cambodia after COVID-19. So these are just some of the things that link to the BRI, that the other side effects of BRI on Cambodia.
If I could just complicate this picture just a wee bit more on Cambodia, there was a point where the Cambodian government decided to ban online gambling because the Chinese government had asked, in fact, would they stop that? And then there was this big outpour. A lot of people left. So there are a bunch of different factors that are going on.
Mm-hmm.
Kevin, you want to talk at all about this from Myanmar perspective?
Yeah, briefly. So perhaps not surprisingly, there's a really long history of Chinese cross-border migration into northern Myanmar. I think a way to understand all different types of development is through kind of ethnic Chinese diaspora and relations to China, which is very different than the rest of the country. So that's a very particular difference as soon as you get north of Mandalay. My work has been looking at, as I mentioned before, looking at Chinese agribusiness and resource extraction, and that all works through very embedded Sino-Burmese and Chinese business networks. That's pretty well documented. For BRI, I think it's a bit different because now we're talking, billions of dollars rather than millions, and it's SOEs rather than small-time businessmen in Yunnan. So it's definitely a different type of kind of Chinese business network that's operating. But one study on this in Myanmar said, quote, that it's the major economic actors are ethnically Chinese or have Chinese partners, networks with political and business elites in China, and are favored by the military government. But I don't really think any of that should be too surprising. In terms of the IDP refugee, which is fortunately unique to Myanmar in this case, I wouldn't look at that strictly through the singular lens of BRI projects. That is more a result of armed conflict. But certainly in some cases that is going to have an impact on return and resettlement when the war ceases. And we've seen this the past decade of people returning to places that have suddenly become a major development, a major road or an SEZ or whatever. And they're like, I did not get reimbursed or not reimbursed. I did not get compensated for the loss of that land, or I wasn't there to negotiate anything. And so this is obviously going to cause lots of problems. On the flip side of that, there is good documentation for several different BRI branded projects in Myanmar that has forcibly displaced people without proper compensation. And so it's both the war and the projects themselves that are causing people to lose land and lose their homes. This has particularly been well documented for the Jiaopyu Special Economic Zone in Rakhine State.
So I don't know, we sort of touched on this, but if you compare BRI and current investment in the last 10 years with investment primarily by other foreign governments in the past, how does this compare? I mean, Shuxian was talking about how there was this whole process, this whole cycle with Japan in the 70s. So from your geopolitically grounded position of having worked in Myanmar and working in Cambodia, how does this compare with previous development efforts? And then to add to that, our last question is, what's the local sentiment, not the government sentiment, but do people see this as, oh, here's another foreign government coming in and doing it, this is just the same old thing? Or are you seeing different kinds of responses And any way you want to talk about it would be fine. Samphoas.
Thank you, Professor Stark, for the question. So this is just based on my own observation when I was in the field myself, and seeing and talking to people. Obviously, the local people, especially those who were impacted by this development, such as those who were evicted from their home or their village that lives around, like, for example, along the Express Freeway or the new BRI-funded airport projects. They have, and it's also the civil society groups, they have expressed huge concerns and, an appreciation of the impacts of this, because a lot of them who were evicted from their home or their village, they didn't receive a fair compensation. And it, like having lived, say, for example, having lived in one village for generations and having to start a new life again in a new area that were not fully developed, or make it far away from them going to work, is it's not something that especially in Cambodia, without like public transportation that links town and village to it, so it makes it more difficult for them. And another local sentiment, especially for the general public, is again related to the increase of online fraud and money laundering in Cambodia, with the Chinese business guys in Sihanoukville that have implicated the criminal activity and other gang activity. And so people have expressed concern, and also think that, say, for example, Sihanoukville is no longer a beautiful, quiet town for Cambodia anymore. Even I talked to some of my local friends that some of them did, like, over the years, some of them didn't want to go to visit Sihanoukville anymore until recently, after due to COVID-19, a lot of these Chinese people who came to Cambodia for online gambling or in-person gambling, a lot of them returned back to China. And so it left a lot of empty buildings, and the town went quiet again. So people feels more safe to go back to Sihanoukville. But before that, no one wants to go to Sihanoukville because people associate it as like, oh, it's a crime-infested city now. This was the situation before COVID-19.
Thanks. Did you want to add? No. Kevin, I want to warn Shuxian, I'm going to ask you to give your feedback on all of this, even though you have a maritime perspective. Just to complicate Cambodia, as an archaeologist, I am familiar with just the archaeology, including the Angkor Park, and UNESCO has just come under fire. UNESCO and Apsara, just in the news in the last 2 days, in fact, for all the forced evictions, which actually UNESCO did not stop in the last 2 years or so at Angkor Park. Just to say that when you talk about people getting evicted, or you talk about people, required to move, it's not only through BRI. Like, there are many different ways in which this happens, at least in Cambodia, and this is just one. Okay, Kevin, why don't you talk a little bit about this, and then we'll ask Shuxian for some sage observations.
Yeah, so, I think the two questions are related, in past and current foreign investments, and how does that compare to BRI, and then also local sentiment.
Mm-hmm.
In Myanmar, not unlike the rest of mainland Southeast Asia, apart from Cambodia, which is interesting, do not hold China and Chinese investment in very high regard. To say that differently, using more survey language, Burmese civil society thinks the lowest of Chinese investment in the country of China in the whole region. And I'm sorry I can't remember the survey that was done a year or two ago, but the only country who did not think that way was Cambodia, which I found really interesting. And I didn't read the details of the survey to know how that was done. But from working in Myanmar, I can certainly say this is the case. And that is what differentiates it from other types of investment. Japan is the other major funder via ADB in large infrastructure, and has, from what I can tell, in the Southeast, very similar problems. If you look at the the East-West Economic Corridor that connects mainland Southeast Asia, it goes through Mae Sot into Myawaddy on the other side of the border in Karen State and goes on to Yangon. So that caused all sorts of problems. There's the paramilitary right in Myawaddy, and some believe that is the reason why they took Myawaddy, because they knew this road was coming, and so on and so forth. You see really similar dynamics, except you do not see this like extreme animosity and mobilization amongst civil society to block these types of investments that you do from China. And in that regard, I am a little sympathetic to what it must be like as a Chinese entity to try to do business in an environment like this where your projects are literally being bombed. But I will, to finish, there are two reasons why Burmese civil society feel this way, of which I am also extremely sympathetic to. One is that the Chinese government in Beijing continues to support the Burmese military, no matter kind of what sort of political situation they're in. And that has been awful for the people of Myanmar. And then the second thing is that the people have mostly only experienced very negative impacts from these type of investments, which is to get their resources, to get electricity, to build roads so that Yunnan connects to the Indian Ocean. So not terribly surprising that is not their favorite investor.
We'll get to questions in a minute. I wanted to see whether Dr. Guo had any sort of reflections on this as someone who's really well-versed in international relations. Shuxian, did you want to talk about all of this, or before we take some?
I don't work on Chinese diaspora issues, so I don't think there's anything additional I can add to that.
But just in terms of Chinese investment and Chinese developments, I mean, I know you work on maritime security. Are you seeing the same kind of pushback from Southeast Asian countries? Obviously Philippines, but besides the Philippines, are there similar?
I think there's a question asking specifically about Malaysia. I think I can integrate my my answer to that question to address your question as well. So I think there's we all know that popular perception that BRI is China's geostrategic game because it was proposed by China and supposedly primarily driven by China, and China offers mega infrastructure or other natural resource extraction projects to Southeast Asian countries for geostrategic or political gains, and thereby setting up something like a debt trap so that it can seize strategic assets in these countries later on. But I'd like to echo what Samphoas and Jeff underscored about these countries, the Southeastern countries have their own agency. So the reality on the ground is more complicated. And in reality, actually, like in countries like Malaysia, it's often the recipient government's initiative and efforts to attract Chinese investment and development financing to fuel local economic growth and boost their performative legitimacy in their own country. I think the Najib government's initiation of the East Coast Link Rail project and the two Trans-Sabah pipeline projects are a typical example of how Najib's own company had really lost huge take on a lot of loans and really run risk of bankruptcy. And then he took the project. He broached the two projects to Chinese during his trip to China in 2016, and the Chinese investor, the China Communication Company, construction company, the Triple C company, paid an inflated cost for the project, in part to bail out Najib's own company. So it has been used as an example of how the Chinese investment could fuel, corruptions in local government in recipient countries. But as we can see, the whole details are actually, the reverse in order. It's, corruption happened, and then the Chinese investment also get implicated in these, in many of these projects. And also, I think, these projects have been used by host countries' government to advance their own domestic political agendas and serve the parochial interest powerful domestic constituencies, such as large government-linked businesses, as was the case with Malaysia. And also, I think a parallel a situation can be seen in the Sri Lanka Hamilton case as well. So I think these typically, involve, joint venture contracts awarded to these companies with the local businesses with inflated project costs to enable kickbacks and donations for political electoral purposes. So I think it's inaccurate to simply portray BRI just as a China dominated game, because that lost a key point that the recipient countries really have their own agency. And also related to this point, simply ask whether and how BRI give rise to corruption in recipient countries might risk reversing the cause and effect relationship. There.
Right. It's just that, I guess one question was to what extent is this just a continuation of strategies that Southeast Asian countries have been using, especially with donor nations for some time? Does anyone have any final comments? I know we have questions. We have questions in the room. We have Q&A on Zoom. Anything else you want to say? Panelists?
I do wonder, and maybe it's a question, but since the U.S.-China relationship has gone so cold, and that's definitely affected Cambodia, as you suggest, it's affected Myanmar as well. That's given China more room to maneuver, I think, in the last 5-10 years, or since the pandemic. Maybe not.
I wanted to just comment on something that Sompit said about peace for development.
Great.
Because in Myanmar, it's the inverse of that the military has long said, and that the way that the CMEC has now been branded is development for peace. We build these big infrastructure projects and that will bring peace. And there was some studies I read that interviewed Chinese elites who are part of advancing these BR projects, and they do seem to really believe that is that works. Like, you bring in major roads and special economic zones, and that brings your country peace. But it's in fact done the exact opposite. There's plenty of evidence to show the way that paramilitaries, the military and armed political groups kind of converge over these spaces to basically get a piece of the cash that is flowing through those places, and they pit all of these armed groups against each other, and is causing so many more problems. So it's just interesting to see how kind of this rhetoric of peace gets played in different political contexts in the region.
Yeah, it's interesting. The whole global north model that if you create a middle class, people will all be fat and happy.
Yeah.
But maybe what you're suggesting is it takes really different forms. Maybe we need to rethink even how we imagine development.
Yeah, or your view on liberal peace building.
Yes, and that's, yes, thank you. And thank you to both Samphoas and Shuxian. We're not done. We have questions in the room. I saw a hand up before. Sorry?
Online.
And we have questions online. Could we take the questions from the room first? And thank you, online people, for being patient. Excuse me, you had a question?
Yeah, I've been following about the Silk Road since the beginning of it. I was living in China when it was initiated. And do you know that they built or began a new bank for the Belt and Road? That was a big thing.
There's a new national bank.
What is it called? I should know.
China Development Bank?
I think it's the BRI Bank.
Yeah.
And that was the big thing to finance these projects when they began to build across the desert. They were disappointed that I think there's like 189 countries that have joined into that bank now. Okay, that's big, right? And America would not. They put in their cleanest, most respected communist party man to run that bank. He had nothing against him. So that's all I know. I read about that bank at the time. And the other thing I have a question about, I know about Myanmar, but I didn't know about the Chinese investment there. All I know is that when they go into a country, if it's agreed upon, if there's revolution, they will be out the next day. And that has worked for them on many, many countries. You people know a lot more about this than I do. But they won't stay in if a country goes into revolution. How did they go into Myanmar while they were in revolution? Or is it because of this bank now that runs everything? You know,
Should we start with me?
Yeah, start with Kevin.
Catherine, you.
I can't speak to the.
Wait, sorry, before Shuxian and Samphoas, can you hear the questions?
I can hear, but not very clear. I mean, yeah.
So
Can you repeat
basically,
again?
at the end, what our audience member was asking was she laid out the establishment, I guess, of a BRI bank with 187 or so countries that signed on, but the U.S. wouldn't.
not all at one time.
Not all at one time. And then she said she understood the policy to be that China and BRI would pull out in cases of revolution. So she's asking,
That has been their policy.
it has been their policy, and so she's asking, what about Myanmar? How does that work?
Right. So I can't speak to the specifics of the bank, which I'm forgetting the acronym for. Is it AIB or something like that?
Yes, right.
Yeah. Or the specific policy that you mentioned on pulling out if there's revolution. I think revolution has different meanings depending on many things, but that certainly is not the case for Myanmar. That has been in political crisis forever. So the Chinese are very skillful at navigating the political labyrinth of Myanmar by having friends everywhere. So they can work with ethnic armed organizations as they do. Some they may even arm. They work with the military. They worked with the government that is now in exile. And so depending on the political tilt of the country, which changes every few years in a rather dramatic way, China can still maneuver. Not always to their liking, of course, but they can still operate, which sets them apart from many other donor countries. That certainly is not the case that Western governments operate. That, again, I said pulled out majorly after the Rohingya crisis. So, China is definitely there. There is a serious revolution happening in all forms of the word happening right now, and they are actually actively having meetings with Min Online to make sure that their projects are advancing, which goes back to this issue of civil society is extremely disappointed with China, and this is yet another example of that. This is not the time to try to make sure that your projects are being advanced when there's political revolution happening.
Yes, Ben. Speak loudly, please.
Oh, no, my pleasure. No. I can be quite boisterous. No, my question, so we're at an academic institution that has a lot of international students here. And we've already spoken about sort of the position of the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia, but of course, China is also bringing in lots of international students from these countries. Cambodian students, Laos students, Vietnamese students, Indonesian students studying at Chinese universities, with, being placed in international student dormitories, getting scholarships. What are the positions of these international students when they go back to their countries in Southeast Asia? And is there a relation between what they're doing and the Belt and Road Initiative? And maybe that's a big question, but if there's any enlightenment on it, that would be greatly welcome.
I'm not someone who can comment. I don't know, Samphoas, if you have colleagues who have come.
I can comment a little bit. Thank you, Ben, for a good question. I mean, that's a very important question. I can comment based on the gist of it, that I know that there also, I mean, in recent year, especially over the last decade since BRI was launched, the Chinese government actually has been pouring in a lot of scholarship money to bring Cambodia to study in China, even offer like a remote PhD program for Cambodian government officials, like top officials who maybe want a master or PhD, and they can even do it without going to China and receive funding. And after a couple of years, then they receive the degree. So their role, I mean, say for example, like this kind of graduate scholarship, I mean, getting a degree for free from China, who wouldn't want it? And especially if you can do it remotely and you're already a government official. So I guess you can kind of guess the answer. And whereas for some younger student who get scholarship to study in China for like say bachelor or master's degree, they a lot of them, and they also have to learn Chinese too while they're there, even if the program is English. So when they come back to Cambodia, a lot of them end up having jobs in government office to some capacity. Yeah.
But just to be fair there, they become cultural brokers the same way as students who come to the University of Hawaii become cultural brokers when they go back for America, right? I mean, everyone's doing that. The Taiwan has its own southbound policy. Mm-hmm. It's very common. Just China is doing such a better job than the United States. I mean, because of the sheer amount of money it's pouring into training.
I completely agree. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, Kevin wants to add.
Just because I like this interesting comparative of different countries with their relationship to China and the investment. Mm-hmm. So, like, I can't even think of one Burmese person who I know who has gone to China to get a degree. I know it's happening, but I don't know a single person, but I can't even count the number of people who I know who have gone to the UK, to Australia, and the US. Right. And again, I think this is reflective of, one, the people I know, but also biased, but also of how they think about China, mm-hmm. and that's not where they want to get their education to learn about the world. Mm-hmm. But I bet that there's military families who are probably, I know for a fact they're sending military children to Russia, sure. And presumably also China. Mm-hmm. But the sons and daughters of cronies are also, from what I know, not sending their children to China or Russia. They are sending them to the UK and Australia, not here because they're all mostly sanctioned, so we don't allow them to come.
And I want to echo that for Cambodia. I mean, I know, 30 years ago, there weren't any good scholars in Cambodia, but there are tons of them now, and the ones I know are Western educated, and I don't know any Chinese educated. But I'm so high on how well the Khmer have joined the academic world. The thinking world.
ASEAN in general has a preference still for the Western countries for postgraduate education. ICS, what is it? Institute for Southeast Asian Studies, USHOF, ISAC Institute in Singapore puts out a report every year. And that's kind of an interesting contrast. I didn't look specifically at how different countries view China. It wasn't uniformly negative or anything, but for postgraduate study, they definitely prefer Western countries right now. But a lot of that might be because English is this sort of lingua franca for the world. Yeah, Terry, you had a question.
Yeah, I guess I want to take the education component or idea and kind of reverse, not going to China, but what I've experienced with Tibetan communities in the Himalayan region, as well as what's happening in Nepal. The Chinese are funding schools and villages, so Mandarin is also being taught, and there's that whole sort of cultural re-education of the Tibetans in Tibet and the Uyghurs. And so I'm just wondering, to what extent is something like that happening in Southeast Asia? Because that's, as a child, I had a suitcase packed under my bed in the Himalayas because we were always under threat of a war between India and China. So it's a concern just because it feels like a sleight of hand through education. America does the same thing, but I'm just
wondering to what extent is it happening in Southeast Asian countries?
I think it's a complicated question because there are so many people, particularly in cities in Southeast Asia, who have Chinese ancestry.
Yeah.
So there are plenty of Chinese schools. I work in Battambang, and there's a Chinese school that just got cleaned up, but they're big Chinese Khmer populations, and they want their kids to have experience in their dual heritage. So maybe it's a little bit different from, say, in the Himalayas. But I don't know if that's the case also.
Oh, there's Chinese schools everywhere in northern Myanmar because a lot of people that's actually like they speak Burmese, Chinese, and then they want to speak English.
So it has kind of a different, I think it has kind of a different role. It's a little bit more heritage than it's not indoctrination. It's like, this is part of our heritage. I don't know what she thinks.
Is it the community in the country that set up those schools, or has it been set up from outside?
It's set up from inside, but then with support from the outside. But I would say also in Cambodia, the Cham Muslim communities get support from Arab Muslim countries as well, so that their kids can also learn about Islam. I mean, it's happening in all these different directions. It's not China alone.
I will say I've known some Lao that are purposely educating their kids in Chinese because I do see that.
Well,
For business.
Oh, Pin, did you want to add for Thailand?
Yeah, so it seems like the BRI has boosted a lot of global economy.
Yep.
But does it like restrict like the suppliers? Do you happen to know, is it like restricted only to Chinese suppliers? Mainly, what does it mean for the global suppliers to participate in this project?
You mean like how much do the host countries benefit economically?
Yeah, definitely.
And how does it trickle out into the economy?
It's only like the transfer of the procurement and all that would that be the factor in this project as well. And also, I would like to ask to what extent political interference this initiative will lead to greater political interference for Southeast Asia. Yeah.
Well, that's probably the question. I don't know if you heard the question at the end. To what extent does BRI and Chinese intervention affect Southeast Asia more broadly, and to what extent is it political interference? I think that's sort of the question that's behind everything else. And we just have to take care not to think that all the Chinese investments are like that, because there are Korean investments, there are Japanese investments. I guess there's still Russian, not so much as before, but and Indian investments and so on. Anyone want to try to think about Pin's questions?
Well, I just reiterate the agency.
Right.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry.
There is a question specifically to Dr. Fox. Could you tell about the BRI investment in Indonesia? What are the government attitudes, and are there any backlash on the U.S.-Indonesia relationship?
So asking, if you couldn't hear just now what Emo is repeating as a Q&A from our Zoom, Dr. Fox here is being asked to comment on the impact of BRI on Indonesia and what the local response is.
Well, I had to prepare for doing this talk on Cambodia. The BRI is not my topic. I've read newspaper things on Indonesia as well. I do think, again, Indonesia has agency. They are a wealthier country. They are controlling that investment. We're actually having a big meeting. We have this Luce Foundation for East-West Center Luce, as opposed to Miriam's Luce, on vulnerable deltas. And we're actually going out where they're going to build a new capital city, Samarinda, way out in East Kalimantan. And there's a lot of Chinese money there. And we are having a Chinese speaker, specifically on, I'm not sure the speaker's Chinese. Somebody is we're bringing from the Wilson Center in DC a speaker on BRI in Indonesia. So I'll know a lot more in a month from now, but I don't know a whole lot right now.
Other Q&A from the Zoom? Oh, just comments. And yeah, we're coming to the close here. I wondered if I could, this is cold calling, ask each of the speakers to give just any final comments, reflections, and I'm going to reserve Shuxian for the end, just to think about our conversation and any points you think require reiteration or any other insights you wanted to add. So I'm going to ask Samphoas first because she's a political scientist, so she's always asked to do this and stroke her beard and give her opinion. So you're on the hot seat now, Samphoas.
Thank you for putting me on the hot seat, as usual, Professor Stark. So as a political scientist, I mean, we know both the positive and the negative impacts of BRI. But I like to think, as what we mentioned, to give a small giveaway that we have to think about the impacts of BRI more from the recipient countries' perspectives and socioeconomic narrative of each particular country, because BRI have leave different impacts on each country based on each country's socio-political aspect. So see, as we have been talking about, the comparison of the different kind of impacts and the reactions between Myanmar and Cambodia, both are developing countries, but both countries have very different, the local sentiment have very different opinions and reactions toward the BRI. So I think many scholars have also started to raise this point where we need to think about the BRI beyond just that threat, but think about the BRI as a project that enables these recipient developing countries to drive forward their political goal. So I'll just end it here.
Thank you so much. How about Jeff?
Well, I don't have a beard to stroke or wisdom to sprout, but I do think, so we focused on Cambodia and Myanmar, not Laos either. Those are sort of the three poor Southeast Asian countries. Vietnam, of course, is very different and has a totally different relationship with China, and Indonesia and Malaysia as well. And I think the stories playing out there are probably very different. They're less poor. They're perhaps a little more in control of their own destinies. I'm not sure that may be the right way of saying it, but what we've been talking about is one cut on BRI, certainly not the whole Southeast Asia cut on BRI.
Yeah, thanks. I would just add, as someone who at least used to work in the Philippines, there's just different challenges. Every country has different challenges and approaches these things quite differently based on what their own interests are, I would say. Kevin?
I came here prepared to kind of double down on talking about agency within the receiving countries and local, as a geographer, local context. And so I'm just so happy to see that,
that we're saying it.
That everyone is saying it. And you can definitely see this arc when people first started writing about BRI, which was so monolithic and so absent of the receiving country of having any agency of that. And so we've come a long way in scholarship and discussions and thinking about the nuances of the way this actually plays out. And I already spoke to, in Myanmar, you got to look at it through the national political context at that moment, and also specifically in the places that these infrastructure projects are passing through, and that deep relationship with armed conflict actors, which is a mess.
Thank you. Shuxian, any comments for us?
I think at the end of the day, I think I also want to address your question about Indonesia. I think both Indonesia and Malaysia are excellent example of when we look at the question of whether influence involved in BRI is one-way or two-way road in this whole big picture, because many scholars have addressed the question of whether and to what extent BRI has really translated into expanded Chinese influence in Southeastern countries. And we have seen a lot of scholarly work have shown that the result is mixed at best. But again, I'd like to dial back to our conversation and underscore that recipient countries have their own agency, and there is question of whether and to what extent influence can go the other way around. That is, do BRI projects provide the recipient countries with any leverage in their bargaining with China, in their dealing with China? Because I approach the BRI issue through my study on maritime disputes, and also Indonesia and Malaysia are a good example, because they are the top. They are two Southeastern countries receiving the largest number of Chinese BRI investments. So I think both cases can be, both countries can be used to pinpoint some possible pathways that these countries, Southeastern countries, can generate some additional leverage when dealing with China. First, I would call it tiny hands, because the Chinese leadership's public pledges increase potential costs in the event of BRI projects, especially high-profile projects like such as the ACLR in Malaysia, and also the Bandung Jakarta high-speed railway in Indonesia. So in the event that such high-profile BRI projects fail to follow through, that it can generate, can potentially generate potentially heavily cost on the leadership himself. So such political priorities of Chinese leadership often combine with reputational concerns for China as an advocate and financier for global development, and making major BRI projects too symbolically important to fail. And the second pathway, I would say, is probably by generating what we call sunk costs, because high-profile projects are themselves costly actions that can create such costs and also create new stakeholders in the Chinese political and business system that have an incentive or vested interest to push these projects forward. And also, lastly, I think the third potential pathway is what some scholars like Meg Mithmar at Harvard call the effect of economic entanglement, meaning that if there are multiple projects, Chinese BRI investment projects, in a single country, this may create an ecosystem where the fate of any given project may be linked to the health or status of other projects. So I think through these three potential pathways, the influence can go the other way around, meaning emanating from Southeastern countries to China going forward. I'll stop there. This is what I've observed from what I've learned from other folks, my co-panelists. And thanks for having me again.
Well, thank you very much to everyone for participating. It's been very enlightening, and we appreciate your patience with the technical challenges we've had. So we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.